Hello and welcome back to Meet Mozart. I'm Angie, that's Mozart, and today we are going back in time to find out if opera performances were always so formal and, shall I say, stuffy? So let's get started by going back to the beginning. When the first operas were performed in around 1600 in Italy, they were mainly presented to kings, queens, dukes, etc., different members of the nobility, who would hire on a court composer and commission them to write a work for a special event, such as a wedding, or perhaps there was a foreign dignitary coming to town they really wanted to impress. And so because these operas were not necessarily the main focus of that event, they were usually a little bit smaller. They had a lot of the same material, such as recitatives and arias, although the arias were much shorter and more song-like. They also had chorus numbers, smaller ensembles, and they were accompanied by a smaller chamber ensemble. And in terms of the sets, although they spared no expense and bought really elaborate set designs, the spaces they were performing in were not as well equipped to take on things like stage mechanics, and so although they were elaborate, they were a bit more subdued. When operas began to grow in popularity, however, there were a lot of wealthy families across Italy that saw how they could really profit, and so they began to build the first public for-profit opera houses. Sometimes they would take an old theater that had already been used for plays and then equip it to more operatic uses. And in other instances, they would build entirely new theaters altogether, which is the case of the first opera house, San Cassiano in Venice, that was built in 1637. Once the door to public opera houses opened, it was a trend that spread throughout all of Europe. And over the course of the next 100 years or so, nearly every single city in Italy was operating at least one or two opera houses. And they really considered them to be just the pride and joy of the province. But attending an opera at one of these opera houses during this time period in Italy actually has more in common with attending a modern-day sporting event than it does with attending a modern-day opera. First of all, operas were a huge societal trend, so anyone who could afford a ticket was going to be at a performance. And ticket prices were structured at various levels so that a wider variety of audience members could attend. So everyone from the nobility to the working class were at these operas. If you were a member of nobility or the aristocracy and you had enough money to spend, you could purchase your own private box. And usually they would have to pay an upfront fee for the box and then another annual fee to keep that box for the upcoming season. And the rules that opera houses had about what could be done within these boxes obviously changed from house to house, but there were some opera houses that actually allowed them to bring in their own furniture, their own decorations, and really make their box like a home away from home, and it gave them full license to do whatever they wanted with it. If you were more working class and you couldn't afford a box seat, you could still gain a general admission ticket and watch the opera from the lower levels, aka the pit. Once you were in your seats, the focus was not just on the performance in front of you, but it was an opportunity to socialize. So if you were one of the nobility in your boxes, you were hopping from box to box, visiting friends, socializing. They would set up tables and have card games. Even sometimes they would have mirrors in the back of the box, so that way they could view what was going on stage while having their back turned to the actual stage. They would also bring in their servants who would bring them food throughout the performance, and even some opera houses offered a separate gaming room so that throughout the performance you could leave, gamble, and then come back for whatever part of the show you wanted to actually catch. As for those in the pit, they too were busy socializing, and so the whole atmosphere was quite raucous and rowdy and noisy. But one moment in the show would often stop them in their tracks, and that was the moment when a great singer performed an aria. And if a soloist could manage to get the attention of this rather rowdy, boisterous crowd, they would give them their undivided attention and at the end erupt in the most heartfelt applause. This extraordinary performance situation led to the evolution of opera as we know it. So as previously mentioned, when these operas were performed in more of a chamber setting, the pieces were shorter. There were recitatives, arias that were more just like simple songs, and there were also chorus numbers, ensembles, etc. But as it changed to this very different audience, impresarios who were hired on to manage the company and who would have to do things like settle artist contracts and book seasons, realized that in order to get the attention of this crowd, they were going to have to make some changes to what really the focus of opera was. And so instead of hiring huge choruses, which would have been a waste because the audience would have just talked over them anyway, they focused a lot of the operatic material on recitatives, which were necessary in order to move the plot forward, but weren't so musically interesting that the audience couldn't socialize at the same time. And then arias. And the aria form began to change as well. It became longer, and they started using what's called a da capo style, where there was an A section of one type of musical material, followed by a B section with different musical material, and then a repeat of that first A section, but this time with ornaments. And these singers were so able to ornament and create in the moment that it kept the audience wrapped in because they never knew what was going to come next. And even if back to back you went to performances one day after another, you might hear an aria that was presented in a completely different way depending on the mood of the performer who was singing it. So these arias became really key for engaging the audience. This also affected the way set design worked because, of course, they needed to have a spectacle. They needed elaborate designs, and they would use actual jewels in the decorations. They would also create extremely elaborate and accurate battle scenes, which often included live animals and huge amounts of extras. Sometimes these animals were actually even horses that were pulled from the king's own stable. So basically everything about the operatic experience at that time was about huge, huge spectacle. And that was really important for a couple of reasons. First of all, this is the pride and joy of Italy at that time. So they really wanted to make a big, big impression on anyone who came to visit. And that was especially important because the opera season was running during Carnival, which is roughly the time from after Christmas and all the way up until the beginning of Lent, especially in those few weeks before Lent began. And during this time period, first of all, it was a hugely festive time of year, and the idea was sort of topsy-turvy, where in this season of the year, the lower classes could speak and mock and joke about members of the upper class with impunity. So there was a bit of an equalizing going on between the social classes, but it was also a hugely popular tourist season because by then opera had started to travel a bit throughout Europe, and each culture was taking on its own perspective within the art form. And despite having these operatic experiences of their own, when these foreigners came and watched these Italian operas, they were shocked both by the quality of the performance and the attitude of the audience. Of course, this spread of opera into other cultures really started to change a lot of the performance practices as well. And most other cultures had a much more reserved attitude toward the art form. And so that's how over time it became to be more of a respected, quiet, formal affair rather than what it was in these beginnings. But even the foreigners who went to Italy and witnessed those wild and rowdy Italian crowds would be the first to say that despite the fact it looked like they weren't paying any attention at all to what was going on, their love and appreciation for the art form was unparalleled. So the next time that you are sitting in an opera and someone unwraps their butter candy or forgets to turn off a cell phone, try to keep in mind those early Italian opera days and remember that just the fact that they are sitting there is a sign that they actually love and appreciate this genre just as much as you do. And if you're someone who has never been to an opera before and you were put off by the formality of it, take heart, knowing that those characteristics are not necessarily inherent to the genre, although I would recommend being respectful to the people around you. Another great option for those who have never experienced opera before is to find small opera companies that are really trying to fight this stigma of formality. And one of the great ones that comes to mind is Opera on Tap. And they're especially wonderful because they have chapters that run in different cities throughout the United States, so you might be able to find one close to you. And they're really working hard to make opera more approachable. And one of the ways they're doing that is by offering performances in unexpected places, such as bars. So you can enjoy an opera while enjoying a drink and begin your opera journey from there. All right, so that's what we got today. So I hope you enjoyed this video, found it fun, found it informative. If you did, you know what to do. Please be sure to like, comment, subscribe, push all the fun buttons, including that little notification bell so you don't miss our next video. And we'll see you next time. Bye.